thank you for joining the talk about digital art on view, public and private. My name is Christina. I've been running art fairs for the last 9 years, and that's why I'm especially excited to just have a talk here and be a guest and talk about my favorite topic of the digital arts. So my first question is, Andrew, you're doing the Times Square Arts initiative, and you just told us we've been staying over there together, that the initiative is running for over 10 years already.
So the program Times Square Arts, which is the public art program of the Times Square Alliance, is 10 years old.
By the Times Square, you have a daily amount of people, around 320,000 walking by.
Yeah, between 300 and 400,000 a day.
That is a huge amount of people walking by, seeing artwork. Can you conclude anything? What does it do? What does the art initiative do for these people that are walking by there? Is there a conversation? You say it was done and set up in order to trigger conversation. Do you see where this conversation is heading?
I mean, I think this is, for us, the great mystery of our program, for me at least. So again, I work for the Times Square Alliance, and we're the business improvement district of Times Square, and I'm acting director of the public art program, which is a very small group of people and a relatively small budget for doing art in this space. And we have, as you say, between 300 and 400,000 people a day passing through, and it's an incredible audience, you could call them. They're not necessarily there for art, although I think that they're there partially to see some kind of a show or be the show. And so they are, in some ways, I think, very susceptible to taking in art and being surprised by art. But we have so little way to have kind of personal interactions with them, or even be able to spend time on the plazas near the art in order to really, truly understand what their experience is. And so, I mean, one of the things that I'm really excited about, that I'm trying to build right now, is a kind of visitor engagement program, a kind of a docent program, so that we actually get more of that information about how people are interacting with the art, that right now in many cases we only have time to kind of put there and leave and go work on the next thing that we're about to put there.
So I want to hear more about it, about the dialogue part of your program, because it was set up in order to trigger that dialogue with that community as well. But I'm going to go ahead and ask Tiffany. Tiffany, in 2016 you started the space, also on the Times Square. Basically, you know each other well, I assume, no? But you curating art shows, and in that building you also curate if any office or any office building is vacated, and in the meantime you put art into it. So in your experience since 2016, how does it change the environment, and how does a dialogue happen, or does it not happen? Can you measure it somehow?
The funny thing is, even though we're in the center of New York, which is Times Square, and maybe this incredibly with 300, 400,000 people, because I'm in an office building, it's like, it's an invited audience who comes in. So it's not so much the public entering, but more us and the artist looking out and looking at the square and taking it in and conceptualizing it and thinking about it and thinking about the projects you do and thinking about the art history of the square. And so that conversation isn't really taking place yet, but it's more from outside in. We feel like we're in a fish tank looking at this epic world, and then sometimes we slip into the square when we can and do little performances out there, but it's almost, it's like looking at it.
But is it, would you say, as you said, you have an enormous audience that doesn't pick and choose what to see, right? Because it's just there and it takes it all in. And on your end, you have a more curated audience, but that is looking out. But how important is space? In your case, is how important is it that you are, as you said, that you're in this fish tank looking out in this enormous space, and how is the conversation then reflecting upon the artist?
So basically, like, Times Square also used to be a real center for artists, and it had a lot of artist studios. And for example, the Times Square Art Show in the 80s is like a very iconic moment. So it feels like really amazing with projects like yours to be bringing back artists into that space that used to be theirs, that contains. And actually, also in New York, there's such an issue of real estate is an issue because of the high prices, and so it's exciting to go to a place that it's sort of an irony that a place with such high real estate value actually happens to have a lot of empty, vacant spaces, and then it's like wonderful to be able to put artists in there and bring it back to that.
So basically artistic activization, so giving it back to the artists in a way. This is what you're doing. So you're working more with the audience and having that internal monologue of the audience with your art. You're talking with the artists and giving them back space. And so I want to reach out to David. If space is at all an issue for you and Daata editions, do you need the physical space or do you perfectly exist in the internet only?
Both. I mean, we set it up to be on the internet, but it does give you moments where you can see an audience looking and you have time to engage, thus doing things during an art fair week where there's a mass audience coming to look at art. It's not always the ideal time because everyone's busy doing everything, but it's also, I mean, I think from what they're both saying, I think it's still one of the things that's what I try and do with Daata is about commissioning artists and about how do you find ways to empower, and I think we all do. I'm actually not that bothered by the audience. I want to reach audience, but if we start with the artist, you're going to reach audience if the work's good. And I think artists, I mean, at first of Times Square, I used to think, oh, this is a bit too mad. How could anyone want to do anything there? But artists want to see their work being seen. I mean, that's kind of why you make artwork, is to have audience. And it's a brilliant audience, you know, it's like the audience that would never naturally look at art. And I'm often hoping for that audience, but I still speak very much to an audience that seems to know what they're looking at, an art world audience. I'm hoping for a next phase of a wider audience, but you can't judge what they will want. Art is it's a very niche audience.
But this is my question. You have the Daata editions and you commission artists to produce artwork and that can be sold on your platform online. And artists, and you can track the number of people coming to the platform, right? You track it, how popular or how many clicks you got. So you're saying that the artist needs to show their work in order to get feedback, or is the online conversation enough? That's what I'm going at.
I think it's mixed. I mean, I don't have it online to be like online's this magic moment, but it's a way of not, don't have a gallery space. So it's a certain model, and I'm not looking at it as being the ultimate model. I think it's just very important to delineate channels, because with YouTube and Vimeo and other channels, there's no way of knowing everything's got a sort of ring-fenced quality assurance, whereas we're not saying we are the best quality assurance, but we're curatorially consistent and we have art world expertise and art world understanding, so it's to make sure it's an art world platform, not an internet platform of any description.
How do you see artists dealing with digital and being present digital? What do they expect from you? So when you want to come and work with an artist you commission, do they have concrete expectations in terms of the hardware, for example? What needs to be shown, how the sound, or how hardware driven are digital artists? That's what I'm asking, actually.
I don't think that, so our platform is a very strange one because we have so little kind of control. We're on about 25 different, the Midnight Moment program runs on about 25 different entities in Times Square, or screens or electronic billboards. Some of those are made up of many different individual digital displays, so we're on about 68 screens throughout Times Square. And yeah, and they're all, so that's 25 different kind of systems that those are operating on, and 25 people at least who are responsible for programming those videos on on those individual screens. There's no coordination except our ability to coordinate all the people who do that programming. And so I honestly try to lower artists' expectations about how much control they can have over all those situations. But you know, some artists are more particular than others, and that doesn't necessarily I actually have found, I think in what I've happened upon, that digital artists seem to be much more okay with the understanding that the work is going to be seen in many different ways. You know, some of our screens are horizontal, some are vertical, some are striped, and so I think digital artists are maybe used to people watching their work on their own screens and having some loss of control in that way. I find that in some cases, artists who are originally working in film or video tend to be more particular about the dimensions of the work or the frame rates or those kinds of things.
What is your experience, Tiffany?
I mean, I think as a curator, you're constantly mediating artists' expectations. You know, an artist will always start by going fully ambitious and asking for the world, and you're like, okay, but how do we practically do this? So of course there's always technological limitations, but as Andrew said, it varies for each artist. So some artists are happy with a smaller screen, like for example in the exhibition that I just opened in London, Jasper Spissero's film is playing on a vintage television monitor, an old television monitor, and it's just with wireless headphones and very simple. And then Signe Pierce's installation is a 3-channel projection mapped with a screen installation, and that's how she wanted it, and that's how he wanted it. So yeah, each artist wants it differently. So, although of course works can be viewed in any way, like for example with Rachel Rosson's piece, she's just created a VR piece, and it's with multiple headsets in one space. So you walk in, and it's called Stalking the Trace, a new show in London. And you walk in, and there are 4 different virtual reality headsets. We wanted 8, but it ended up being practical to limit it to 4. And then there's an amazing, similar to this space, projection mapped installation surrounding those virtual reality works. But I've also watched the same piece in her studio just on a monitor, which is also effective, but then when you create a whole installation around it and you actually curate it in that way, it becomes just more affecting and more rigorous and more exciting, but both work, and that's the beauty of digital art, is you can view it on a grand scale or a simpler scale, and that's what it offers us.
But in your experience, you curated numerous shows, and do you think there's less rigorosity in the last years? Are they dealing better with this loss of control over hardware? Because I see this hardware component still strongly. That's why I'm trying to dig deeper.
I mean, I think, what do you mean by loss of control? Because
you cannot 100% say, I want a 4-channel, high definition, high quality installation, but actually we have only 2 screens that it might not be as high quality. Like how in the actual
So I think in the
reality.
actual, yeah, but I think that's the same with any show. Like if you're working with painting and you can't show, you just try to show it as well as you can to the artist's specification always, and sometimes you can't, and that's a reality. But usually it's, for me so far in my experience, I've always been able to figure it out in a way that the artist is 100% happy and there's no compromise, and that's really important to me. But yeah.
I mean, I tilted on another axis because I try and work on simple means, and I've often worked with artists with cinemas And I try and keep it finite what I can do, that artists know that if I'm going to show it in the cinema, I'm not going to suddenly put new screens in the cinema or new projectors, because the cost of that, there is no value to me to do that. I don't often have budget to do that. So I usually try and measure their expectations. This is what it's going to be, and if they don't want to do it, they don't have to. But often it's about other things that I provide. I'll provide maybe marketing, some kind of level of art world connection, bring audience, join up the dots for them. I can't do everything, and I think that's, we have different entities that can do, Tiffany's curated some amazing projects, but that takes a sort of, there's material you have to get, and keeping artists happy when you do those is kind of difficult.
So I'm asking also, I'm coming from the art fair world, and I've seen just galleries struggling, basically. Galleries looking around, liking artists, and they want to work with them, and then sometimes this hardware component comes in, but we want to do a show, and then I've seen a lot of struggles around that.
It is difficult. Technology is always failures with technology. It's the kind of, I always think of it like it's really human. It fails really easily, and I can't. But it's, one can mitigate against that as best as one can. But then I've had numerous projects where, something will just not work, and that's sort of life in that zone. But you can have that with painting. You can have a building burned down. I mean, it's like, and paintings can, get damaged by different environments. So it's really trying to find, we just all try our best, and that's kind of...
And I wanted to ask you, because you've been doing a lot of events with different institutions and different partners here. So what is the expectations also from the creatives in terms to your space?
Yeah, so I think to David's point, like, people are playing around with different models, and our model here at Lightbox is, bringing in like brands and corporate companies that are going to do, their own events in here that we help produce, and doing like immersive dining and cocktail parties, and they get access to 360 projections, but that helps kind of sustain the platform where we can give access to artists who work at the intersection of technology and digital. And so we're real estate is really expensive in New York, and being able to operate a business like ours is really expensive, but I think we've figured out the right model to do that, which is really exciting. And in terms of like artist expectations, I mean, so far our experience has been like they're usually seeing their project on a screen that they built, or like on their Instagram, and being able to see it at a grander scale is always going to be very exciting. And having access to like tech teams to help being able to do that. And then just recently, we've kind of expanded our mission outside of Lightbox to be able to give access to artists like kind of bigger platforms on public screens. And we launched something called Decode Experiential. So that's kind of like our digital and artist driven mission with Studios VR, and Jess, who founded it, is here too.
My question is, do you see, because I don't see, maybe I'm wrong, more digital artwork or artists exhibited over the last years? Would you agree, or and why is that? I'm really fascinated. Why is that on the institutional as well as on the private side?
My assumption is always the marketplace doesn't acknowledge it yet. They don't know how to deal with it. So there's a nervousness, there's a lack of confidence in terms of how to sell it, how to show it, how to deal with it. And that is what I guess we're all in a way working towards, and I've been doing it for 20 years. So I felt we were on the cusp 20 years ago. I still think we're on a bigger cusp, but the cusp is still the cusp. And the marketplace, once people work out how to make and earn and have money coming to a project, they work out how to deal with it. It is always the way. There's no alternative model on that front. So you have to find solutions. One of the problems with digital is there's another ecosystem around digital of the idea of the .com sensation, of the business model around it, around investors and around the marketplace of that nature, which is a corrupter of the art world. So anything that's based around business that's trying to sort of find its sort of value before the art is made is already screwed. It's like you have to have the artist make work and be supported. There's no alternative model before that happens.
But I feel this counts more for the private part, for the galleries part, and how far are institutions concerned with that? Maybe Tiffany.
I think institutions are, you know, like 10 years ago, institutions weren't really even talking about digital art. Now, every institution has a like new media acquisitions committee, and they're really thoughtful, and they're including it in their collections and their exhibitions. And I have seen, you know, it's not that every institution looks like this, but I have seen that it is becoming far more in the canon digital art, and it's been legitimized, and there's enough scholarship. Of course, there's still work to be done. We still have to push it forward. But I do feel that there has been I guess I don't agree. I feel like there has been a shift, and it is really, I remember, like, years ago, people would be like, video art? Like, ooh, I hate video art. Why would you even watch that? But now for a legitimate curator to say that would be kind of crazy, you know? It's like, it would be missing a whole element of the art world. So I think that shift is happening, and we're in the middle of it. Yeah.
But do you think it's happening because there's enough staff, educated staff, that can fight for it? Or is it the boards that are coming in, like in your position, as you say, I've seen this work should be considered and looked at, or where is this shift exactly happening?
Well,
or is it a pressure from the artists?
I think it's happening through scholarship. It's happening, you know, there's been so many amazing books by like Lauren Cornell or Omar Khalif, or all these amazing scholars who have really legitimized internet art and considered it and thought about it. There's been amazing exhibitions in so many museums, like the DIS Berlin Biennale, from that to like, you know, shows around the world about digital art that have been so strong and powerful. It's been shown in, digital art has been shown in biennales, and all these little moments for it have amalgamated in the legitimization of new media. And there's new terms like time-based media, and there's understanding as well, and understanding it as a legitimate platform for art. And then the big thing is also being able to save it for, blanking on the word, restoration, or restoration and conservation. Thank you, conservation art. And then there's organizations like Rhizome who are doing research in how are we actually going to conserve all this art. And when museums begin to feel confident that conservation is possible, I think also that encourages more collecting.
But
so
you serve on boards of different museums, but on the private side, so that what David was referring to, that people are nervous or there's no value system yet in place, monetary value system for collecting digital artworks. How much does it concern you as a private collector that this marketplace is not yet in place?
Not so much. That's not why I collect art, you know. I feel like it's important, it's legitimate.
But I guess you had a couple of conversations about that topic, right? With other collectors, I would assume, that are very...
A little, but not actually as much as you'd think. And I think, you know, probably with photography, once upon a time, people said that didn't initially have a market developed later. Projects like Daata are addressing the market issue directly and trying to develop models for a market for digital art. And I think, you know, the art comes first, and then the market can come later. And it is coming, I feel it. But
and in the meantime, the artists have to survive somehow, needs to be supported. So in your experience of 20 years, as you say, what is, when you said the cusp of it, I felt the cusp of it was 20 years ago, and now there's a bigger cusp. What are the occurring questions or reoccurring questions of collectors when they stand in front of a piece and they say, well, I like it, you know, so shall I buy it? So, or what are the questions that are coming about the market maybe, or what are the concerns?
I don't know if I hear those comments too often. I mean, I have collectors. I mean, generally a sort of more enlightened collector is open to most art forms made by artists, most art mediums. It's more those that come to it are looking for, the value of, I want to buy a work of art and what's it worth and that thing. But that doesn't really happen in the dialogues I have in the main. And obviously you get a lot of stupid conversations and you get a lot of interesting ones and you have to filter them through. I mean, I've seen more over that 20-year period, more and more artists, most artists work with technology of some form. Even painters, they use their research, they have their images of their work, even if they're not making digital artworks. Everybody's connecting with it, so it's becoming much more of a natural language. And we're not talking about, that's what's shifting, and I think the collectors are joining into that. It's just taken time. And I think there are more things at Frieze. There's a VR section that was new this year. I've got a screen there. And things are possible. The art fair is just not probably the best place for it because it's such a marketplace that the galleries have such expensive costs to be there, and the return at this point isn't easy to take those kind of risks. So art fairs generally have fairly safe bets of what artwork is brought into that building. And I'm not sure where else I can go with that answer.
On the other hand, so we've been talking about the market aspect of it, and you on the Times Square. You have a canvas that is huge, and just talking about the digital work. So because I've did some research and I saw that you also do on physical sculptures or installations. Can you maybe pinpoint the difference, what it does to the audience that you see in the eyes if you do actually something like physical, to be touched objects, versus digital work?
Well, I think both can be very powerful, and the benefit of I think there's obviously a kind of viscerality to physical works. So if we do a sculpture, we had a great sculpture by Mel Chin, and it was it was very large, it was imposing in even our space, and it was also a great bench, and people loved to sit on it, lie down on it, climb over it, and that is a way that they could interact with that work that they can't interact with the work that's on the screens. Similarly, we do performances on the plazas and in internal spaces in Times Square, and there's I come from a live performance background, and so for me there's always going to be something that's really powerful and visceral about that, the connection between a live performer and an audience.
And so that's the live performance, and in the digital, what do you think? Is it more a storytelling? So what are the more powerful pieces that you saw a strong effect on the people that saw a work? Can you maybe pinpoint that? So I'm looking
Interesting.
for
the
cases.
very strongest, I think, effect was we had a work of a digital work was Peter Burr, a digital artist, video artist who had a midnight moment, and apparently there were a lot of comments to our we have public safety officers in Times Square that people were experiencing seizures from this black and white flashing, which partially indicates that people don't understand what actually causes epileptic seizures, in terms of that is not really possible in our environment. But it's what Peter told me was that his work always gets that reaction. People always say, "I'm having a seizure," when they see his work, and it's something about the kind of the flashing gives them a kind of actually kind of maybe a stomach sense. And so I think that is something that is the rapidity of the changing of the black and white is probably possible really only with the digital, and is really amplified by our we have some of the world's largest HD screens and 8K screens, and so that is just gets in your eyes.
When looking at the Times Square, you also say, you point out explicitly that you're working together with non-for-profits, you're working together with the institutions and with the businesses. So as a public art institution that works together with businesses in the Times Square. So again, this conversation between the private and the public, how does that go? Do you have, so if you go to a business, do they pinpoint and try to ask a KPI out of you? So what do we get out of it? I mean, how do you lead that conversation?
So we are the Times Square Alliance, and we are the Business Improvement District of Times Square, and we're run essentially, our board is made up of, we operate on an assessment on real estate in the district, and so our constituents and our ultimate responsibility is partially to those constituents, but we also have, I think, a responsibility to the citizens of New York and everybody who comes here. But one of the ways that we have talked about to our board about the value of doing public art with their money is the kind of positive press that we get from, and so there have been cases, there have been years where we've looked at the press and 80% of the positive stories about Times Square were related to public art in Times Square because the press loves to, as so many of us, love to talk about what we don't like about Times Square. And so that is, I think, one of those, in terms of how we talk to those particular constituents, that's that kind of the ability of art to change perceptions of Times Square.
So this is a good KPI, positive, you can measure it, you can give statistics compared to, so that's a good selling argument basically for
and
arts.
hopefully fill that vacant retail space or office space.
Okay, and going, that leading this conversation, or going forward with this conversation. So how big is your annual budget? Can you name it? Can you give us an approximation?
Midnight Moment is about $125,000. The full budget of Times Square Arts is about $1 million a year.
A year, okay. And you can probably name numbers, but is it like a tenth of an annual museum budget?
It's
or
a lot less
is it
than
like
that.
3%? Just that...
It's tight.
It's tight.
I can't name numbers, but it's tight. But that's also kind of the fun of it. Because I find when things get high budget, my aim is really to be experimental and just fun and still serious, but enjoy what we're doing, just creation. And when the budget gets too high, sometimes it becomes less enjoyable or you can't experiment as much. So I do really intentionally keep tight budgets because it allows for a lot more freedom.
Interesting, David. What do you think of tight budgets?
I like tight budgets. They're really fun. But operating on a tight budget myself, its mission is to pay artists always, first and foremost. And I think it sounds like the most weird business model, but to me that is the business model, because I have actually then a business that serves artists, and therefore the reputation and its outcomes are broad, as opposed to saying I do this and offering everyone a free platform that they're not going to make anything from. And there's a lot of people in the digital space who say it's going to be really good for you. Well, I know there's one thing that's really good for an artist, to have something coming in to sustain them, but also I'm looking at other partners through the world who are starting to join in to sort of making sure almost every dialogue I have is somebody else has to offer to pay artists or do something of value other than just giving free, a free building or something, which is not so free, doesn't make it always so free. There's quite a big cost.
Exactly. So I would like maybe that you can tell an example how you structure collaborations, because I think this is what I meant exactly, this example, that you have the interest of the artist at heart. So I don't know any institution, probably international, that hasn't collaborated with you on digital art, and maybe that you name how you structure it. not per real numbers, but
No, it's
that
not
is-
numbers. I mean, I structure it on a sort of goodwill basis to start with. I have a reputation of delivery. So for me, it's a sort of quirky area of the art world as we're all discussing it. And I've been sort of not, I'm still standing doing it. I've been doing it, and it's a commitment to doing it. So there's a sort of trust, and I have that trust actually with everyone on the panel too, even you, because we've collaborated or aimed to collaborate in Vienna, and I was in Vienna anyway at the fair for another project that was going on to do with blockchain, which is coincidental. You know, I think there's a desire for all of us to collaborate with those that sort of care, and I guess that's what I'm looking for in any. I mean, I've got several models right now, one with Phillips Auction House where we're co-commissioning some works. They're actually paying, and they're putting a budget together to pay the artist and put on the exhibitions and promote the project, and on Park Avenue. So I'm hoping it hits an audience I'd never hit. It's hitting an auction house audience I'd never know how to get to or even want to get to normally, but it's people who buy art. So for me, that then broadens the conversation out. On another model, I'm working with MoCAD in Detroit, who've received funding from the Knight Foundation, but they are going to commission 6 artists I requested based in Detroit, and they'll be on the platform, and we'll launch them at Expo Chicago, a big art fair in Chicago. So there's different, I've just looked for different outcomes and different models, working with different people, because it's just the broader you can speak about this and have it seen in real terms. You know, I feel like I'm a sort of, you know, my father was a preacher, so I think I carry on that good tradition.
And Daphne, so we in the art world, we love tight budgets or not. We also love bigger budgets, and when it comes to business, so when businesses come in here and want to do something creative, and how do you see their quality assessment in terms of budgets? How much freedom, how much budget do they actually allow to creatives to create something unique?
I think the answer is not enough. I mean, you know, like the brands and the corporate companies that come in here, some of them have tighter budgets, a lot of them have a lot of budgets, and I think, you know, sometimes we just kind of see them wasted away to either like, you know, having too much control over the creatives that they hire or like the artists. And sometimes, you know, like you know, from what I've heard from kind of the community of artists that we have here is they say no to projects, even sometimes with money, because it's like, it doesn't feel authentic. And then on the other hand, you know, what we've been kind of doing on the digital art side of things, that's also a tight budget that we work with. So, and it's the same way as David, it's like we've played around with models where we, you know, on top of providing the artist with a space that already has a bunch of technology that they can use and customize, we give them a little stipend to do something in here, and then we open the space for 3 days, and, you know, that comes at costs that I think are valuable, but that we provide the artist with. But yeah, I think in terms of, you know, the brands and corporations, like they should be putting more kind of, you know, creative money towards the artists that they don't enough right now.
One of the problems with the brand is they usually don't have people in place who understand the art world. So the idea, they want other expectations from it. And again, there's a team of people here who all, you know, that's what we do day in, day out, and care at different levels or different ways. And I think that's the problem, because they're looking for, you know, profit, or they're looking for great marketing outcomes, and that just isn't really in my consciousness as I work. I was trying to find the best outcome for the artist or their artwork, and I think that's the same across this team.
Again, on the private side, so we've been talking about the industry, but collectors, do you get a lot of people or other collectors, starting collectors, asking you about advice, where to look at, where to go to start a digital collection? And what do you tell them?
Data editions.
I like that. I think we've worked it out.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
But actually, it's really an amazing place for a young collector because it's affordable. Maybe David should talk
I
about
think
this.
I like it, you speaking, because it makes it feel less egotistical. But it is aimed at being affordable, and it is about, you know, it's a platform to, you know, I want many more. I mean, my desire for business model is that there are many, because then you have a proper marketplace. When there's just a few, people still look at it, they're a bit gingerly tiptoeing into that arena. But we start off very easily, and because of some of the projects we're doing with Philips, there's a sort of, a different audience looking, a bigger one. We've been doing it for 5 years, and in any startup, that's kind of a long time, and we aim to carry on. Its aim was never to be a big profit center. It was about profit was always aimed at commissioning new artists. That was its model.
What I like about it for young collectors as well is that it's educational. So you can go on the site and actually learn about the artist before acquiring it and it's like you can really educate yourself in video art today by just looking at that platform as a starting point. So it's definitely worth looking at, even if you're not looking to buy art.
And so you said as a starting collector, but you as an experienced collector and experienced people in the art world, so can you give a projection? Where do you see the art world heading in 5 years? Do you think it will be all digital, will be half digital? Can you give me like a projection? How do you see that? Because the art world is changing, I remember the times when galleries hated social media, but eventually they all had to do it. So how do you think the art world will look like in 5 years from now?
I think just like, and I'm not like a digital art expert by any means, but I think there's going to be a lot of technological advancement that is going to make it so much easier to grasp and buy and, collect. So I think that's kind of where I see things going. Even us at Lightbox, when we're doing research on like new tech products, it's like making it easier for anyone to be able to code or, create content or turn on a projector. And like right now, I think that's what people are kind of scared about because it requires kind of a lot more than just hanging a piece on your wall. So I think I'm really hoping to see kind of art fair picking up on it and for the technology to just be able to help, sustain that.
And as most artists are touching upon it, it's almost inevitable because you're going to get the next wave of museum leaders and art fair directors who aren't as scared and nervous of it, and gallerists too. So it's a sort of slow build, but it's also, we're here talking about, not here talking, but there's VR projects, AR, blockchain. This was not in conversation 3 or 4 years ago. There was nowhere talking about this. Almost 5 years ago, you wouldn't have had a conversation in any way. And so that's almost becoming, well, you might disagree, but it was, I'd never had that conversation. People were still worrying how they'd, I started off with, 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter worries that moved to beta SP tapes, that's moved to Blu-ray, and we're just, things shift, and I think that's exciting. I don't think we should ever build a model that's dependable upon any one way, because I think one way is going to shift. There's also fads. That's one of the issues we have, of people get overexcited by the fad of technology, and I think once we can move on from its faddishness, it might take 50, 100 years of shifting of that one. I don't know, but I think, I guess time tells us there are many fads, and we go through many. I remember as an art student, there was a big, in England at the time, everyone was loving a certain group of Scottish painters. Then you had the YBAs, and these become sort of fad movements of art. You only need a certain shift, and we're getting to sort of fads where certain groups of artists are working with technology, and then people take it more seriously.
So in 5 years, you think there will be an economic model?
Yeah.
So digital art has from its beginning, developed alongside the development of technology. Computers started as an academic sort of project, so artists were there from the start of it. And as technology develops, digital art shifts. So like David, which is exactly what David just said. So for example, now the internet has already been commandeered, so now artists are moving on to virtual reality, which feels like the new free space that's unexplored, and they're starting to be the first pioneers of exploring that territory. But then I can't predict what will come after that because it hasn't been invented yet. But I'm sure the minute it arrives, artists will be there and they'll be developing it. And digital art is another medium now. It already is. And it's as legit a medium as any of the others. And that will continue. And I think people will begin to understand that more and more.